The courtroom was cold, the way courtrooms are always cold, the kind of institutional chill that has nothing to do with the weather outside and everything to do with the particular atmosphere of a place where people come to have their lives decided by strangers. I was sitting at the plaintiff's table in a courthouse in Sacramento, California, on a Wednesday morning in the middle of February with my attorney beside me, and a flash drive in my bag that contained the most important 47 minutes of audio I had ever recorded in my life. And I was watching my mother-in-law, Diane, sit at the defendant's table across the room with her own attorney, and her hands folded neatly in her lap, and her face arranged into the particular expression of dignified composure that she had spent 67 years perfecting, the face of a woman who had never done anything wrong in her life, and was merely present in this courtroom as a formality. I had been waiting for this morning for 14 months. 14 months since Diane had stood on the front lawn of my neighbor Carol's house during a block party in December, and told everyone within earshot that I was emotionally unstable, that I had been hospitalized for mental illness, that my husband James was only staying in the marriage out of obligation and fear for the safety of our 2 children, that she had personally witnessed me having episodes in which I became violent and irrational, that she had tried to get me help and had been rebuffed, that she was worried about the welfare of her grandchildren and believed that someone should intervene before something terrible happened. None of this was true. Not one word of it. I had never been hospitalized for mental illness. I had never had an episode of violence. I had never been irrational in a way that posed any threat to my children or my husband or anyone else. I was a 42-year-old woman who worked as a high school chemistry teacher, who coached her daughter's swim team, who volunteered at a food bank on Sunday mornings, who had been married to James for 16 years, and who had maintained a civil if always tense relationship with her mother-in-law for all 16 of those years, despite the fact that Diane had never believed I was good enough for her son, and had made that belief known in 100 small ways over 100 different dinners and family gatherings and holiday celebrations. But Diane had made a mistake on the morning of December 14th. She had made a mistake so precisely timed and so completely documented that it had transformed the situation from my word against hers into something else entirely. Something that no amount of dignified composure or folded hands could undo. And I was sitting in a cold Sacramento courtroom waiting for that mistake to be played to a judge who was going to hear exactly what kind of woman Diane was, and what she had done and why. My name is Rebecca, and I want to tell you how I got to that courtroom, because I think the path matters as much as the destination, and I think understanding how Diane had operated for 16 years is the only way to understand why that recording was so significant, and what it meant for everyone whose lives had been touched by her particular brand of cruelty. Diane had always been the kind of woman who believed that love was a transaction, and that the people in her life owed her something in return for her presence. She had raised James to be successful and accomplished, and she believed that his success was partially her creation, and that she was therefore entitled to a permanent role in his life that superseded anyone else's claim on him, including mine. When James and I got married, she had smiled through the ceremony and embraced me at the reception and said, "Welcome to the family," and I had believed her because I was 26 years old, and I thought that difficulty between mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law was a cliché that applied to other people. I learned differently within the first year. The comments started small, the way all campaigns of attrition start small, too subtle to point to individually but accumulating over time into something that had real weight. She would say things at family dinners that were technically complimentary, but that contained embedded criticisms so precisely placed that I could not address them without sounding oversensitive. She would make suggestions about how I ran my household that implied I was doing it incorrectly. She would ask questions about my parenting in front of other people that were framed as curiosity, but that were actually audits. She would tell James things about me that were distorted versions of conversations she and I had had, edited in ways that made me sound difficult or irrational or unreasonable. And then when I addressed these distortions, I would sound defensive and emotional, and she would sound measured and concerned. James was not a bad man. I want to be clear about that because it matters for the story. James loved me and he loved his children, and he was aware that his mother was difficult in ways that he had spent his entire life managing. But he had also spent his entire life being told by Diane that he was extraordinary, and that the people around him were often not measuring up, and this had created in him a slight but persistent tendency to take his mother's side in ambiguous situations, to give her the benefit of the doubt, in moments where another person might have challenged her interpretation of events. I had lived with this for 16 years. 16 years of dinners at which I felt evaluated rather than welcomed. 16 years of holiday celebrations that contained a low-grade tension nobody acknowledged. 16 years of managing my behavior carefully in Diane's presence so as not to give her anything she could use, while simultaneously living with the knowledge that she was looking for things to use. 16 years of watching Diane cultivate relationships with people in our community, our neighbors, the parents at our children's school, the members of her church, building a network of people who thought she was wonderful and gracious and devoted to her family, and who would therefore be predisposed to believe anything she said about anyone. The block party was in December, and the weather was unusually warm for Sacramento that time of year, which is why people were standing outside instead of moving indoors. I was inside Carol's house getting more wine from the kitchen when I heard my name from the backyard, not from close range, but carried clearly on the still air through the open window above the kitchen sink. I heard Diane's voice, and I heard my name, and I heard the word unstable, and I stopped moving, and I stood at that kitchen sink, and I listened. Diane was talking to a group of our neighbors. She spoke quietly and carefully, the way she always spoke, the way someone speaks when they are accustomed to being listened to, and have learned that a lowered voice commands more attention than a raised one. She said she was worried about me. She said she had been worried about me for some time. She said that James was struggling in the marriage because of my volatility, and that she had tried to suggest that I speak with a professional, but that I had responded badly to the suggestion. She said that there had been incidents she did not want to describe in detail because she valued my privacy and James's privacy, but that if people had noticed I seemed different recently, it was because something was genuinely wrong, and she felt that the neighborhood should be aware in case there were any concerning situations involving my children. I stood in Carol's kitchen, and I felt something happen inside me that I can only describe as the simultaneous arrival of clarity and fury. Clarity because I understood in that moment that what Diane had been doing for 16 years in small ways, she was now doing in a large way, that she had decided to escalate from subtle undermining to open character assassination, that she had assembled an audience and was performing for them with the specific intention of destroying my reputation in the community where I lived. And fury because I understood that every single word she was saying was a deliberate lie. I did not go outside. I put down the wine bottle and I took a breath and I went home. Our house was 3 doors down from Carol's, and I walked the distance in the December night, and I went inside and I called my sister and I told her what I had heard. My sister said, "You need to document this," and I said, "I know," and she said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "I am going to think about it carefully." I thought about it carefully for 2 weeks. I spoke to my doctor, who confirmed in writing that I had no history of psychiatric hospitalization and had never been referred for mental health treatment beyond a brief course of therapy after my father's death 7 years ago, therapy that was completely standard and that no reasonable person would characterize as evidence of instability. I spoke to James, who was horrified by what his mother had said, and who called her and had a conversation that I was not present for but that he reported as extremely difficult, a conversation in which Diane apparently denied saying what I had heard and suggested that I had misunderstood or misremembered. She told James I had misremembered. She told him my perception of events was distorted. She told him I was doing exactly what she had described to the neighbors, becoming irrational when challenged. That was when I decided I needed to document everything, because I understood that I was dealing with someone who would never stop and who would simply adapt her methods as long as she was not confronted with evidence she could not deny. I started carrying my phone with me everywhere. I started recording conversations with Diane whenever I was in her presence. In California, you can legally record a conversation to which you are a party, which means that any conversation I was participating in, I was legally allowed to record. I did not tell Diane I was recording. I did not tell James. I simply pressed record every single time Diane and I were in the same room. For 6 weeks, I recorded ordinary conversations, family dinners, brief exchanges at the door when Diane came to visit, phone calls she made to our house and that I answered. The recordings showed nothing dramatic, nothing that by itself would have been enough, just the low-grade patronizing commentary that I had been experiencing for 16 years. The careful management of words that contained criticism without explicitly stating it, the control of information without technically lying. None of it enough to prove anything in court, but all of it building a pattern. Then, on the 14th of February, Diane came to the house while James was at work. She said she wanted to talk to me about some concerns she had. She sat down at my kitchen table and she spoke for 47 minutes, and I sat across from her with my phone face down on the table between us, and every word she said was being recorded. She told me that she knew I was unhappy in the marriage. She told me that she had spoken to James and that he was also unhappy. She told me that she thought I should consider separating from James for the good of the children, that my presence in the household was creating instability. She told me that she had already spoken to an attorney about the custody implications, and that I should be aware that my documented history of emotional difficulty would be a factor in any proceedings. She told me that she had been carefully building a record of her concerns about my behavior over the past several years, and that she was prepared to testify on James's behalf if it came to that. She told me that she thought the most dignified outcome for everyone involved would be if I simply agreed to move out of the house and allow James to have primary custody of the children and find my own apartment and start a new life. She said all of this in her measured, careful voice. She said it the way she said everything, with a surface warmth that made each sentence sound like it was coming from a place of genuine concern rather than calculated aggression. She said it while sitting at my kitchen table in the house, where I had lived for 12 years, and where my children had grown up, and where I had built a life that she was now sitting in my own kitchen trying to dismantle. I said, "Thank you for sharing your concerns, Diane. I said I will think about what you have said. I said I appreciate you being direct with me." I walked her to the door and I closed it behind her, and I picked up my phone and I pressed stop on the recording, and I sat down on the kitchen floor with my back against the door, and I thought about what I was going to do next. I sat on the kitchen floor for a long time with my back against the front door and my phone in my hand. I sat there until I heard the school bus stop at the corner and knew that my daughter Emma and my son Daniel were about to come through the door, and I stood up and I smoothed my clothes and I went to the kitchen and I started making after-school snacks. Because children need after-school snacks, regardless of what their grandmother has just attempted in the kitchen where those snacks are being made. Emma came in first and said, "Mom, you look weird," and I said, "I am fine, I just have a headache." And she said okay and took her snack and went upstairs. And Daniel came in behind her and said, "What is for dinner?" And I said, "Pasta," and he said, "Great." And that was the entirety of the conversation, and I stood at the counter, making pasta for two children who had no idea that their grandmother had just sat in their kitchen and attempted to destroy their mother's life. James came home at 6:30. And I told him that his mother had come by and that we needed to talk, and he looked at my face and said, "What happened?" And I said, "Diane came here today while you were at work, and she told me that she has been building a case against me for custody proceedings, and that she has already spoken to an attorney, and that she thinks I should move out of the house and let you have primary custody of the children and find my own apartment." James's face went through several expressions in rapid succession, and he said, "She did what?" And I said, "I have it on recording if you would like to hear it." And he said, "You recorded her?" And I said, "Yes. James, I have been recording her for 6 weeks, because after the block party, I understood that this was going to escalate, and I needed documentation." James listened to 12 minutes of the recording that evening. He sat at the kitchen table, and he listened to his mother's voice, telling me to leave my own home, and to give up custody of my children, and to start a new life somewhere else. And his face did something complicated that I understood was the face of a man who had spent his entire life believing his mother was a difficult but ultimately loving person, realizing in real time that she was something else entirely. When he finished listening, he said, "I need to call her." And I said, "James, before you call her, I need you to understand something, which is that I am going to use this recording. I am going to take this to an attorney, and I am going to pursue every legal option available to me. And I need you to decide right now whether you are standing with me on this or whether you are going to try to protect her." James looked at me for a long time and then he said, "I am standing with you. I have always been standing with you. I am sorry I did not stand with you more clearly before now." He called Diane that evening, and I was not present for the conversation, but I could hear from the single side of it that was audible through the walls that it was not a pleasant conversation, and that it ended with James saying things he had apparently never said to his mother before. When he came back downstairs, he said, "She denies everything," and I said, "Of course she does," and he said, "What are you going to do?" And I said, "I am going to find an attorney." My attorney's name was Linda, and she specialized in defamation and family law, and when I played her the recording, she listened to the entire 47 minutes without saying a word, And when it was finished, she said, "This is extraordinary." And I said, "I know." And she said, "Do you understand what you have here?" And I said, "I have a recording of my mother-in-law telling me she has been deliberately constructing a false narrative about my mental health to use against me in a potential custody proceeding, while simultaneously directing the campaign of reputational damage in the neighborhood." And I said, "I want to sue her for defamation." Linda said, "You have a very strong case for defamation and potentially for intentional infliction of emotional distress." And I said, "I want to pursue both." And she said, "We can do that, but I want to make sure you understand what this is going to do to your family." And I said, "My family has already been damaged. What I want now is for Diane to stand in a courtroom and hear what she said played back to her in front of a judge." Linda filed the lawsuit 3 months later. When Diane was served, she called James and apparently spent an hour on the phone alternating between tearful denials and outraged accusations, none of which changed the fact that the lawsuit had been filed and that Linda had already sent a letter to every neighbor who had been present at the block party, informing them that they might be called as witnesses in a defamation proceeding. Diane hired an attorney of her own, a man named Gerald, who had a reputation for aggressive defense strategies, and who filed an immediate counter-motion attempting to have the recording excluded from evidence on the grounds that Diane had not known she was being recorded. Linda responded with the California one-party consent law, which is clear and settled, and which Gerald knew perfectly well, but apparently hoped would be less settled in this particular judge's courtroom. The judge ruled that the recording was admissible. Gerald then attempted to argue that the context of the recording was being misrepresented, that Diane was expressing concern for her grandchildren, rather than orchestrating a campaign of harassment, and Linda countered this by presenting the full pattern of behavior going back 14 months, the block party comments, the statements to neighbors, the documented campaign that had resulted in 3 of our neighbors independently telling me things that Diane had said about me that I knew to be false. Linda also found something else. She found that Diane had sent emails, not to me, but to members of her church community and to 2 parents from my children's school, emails in which she described my supposed mental health issues in terms that were more specific and more damaging than what she had said at the block party, emails in which she mentioned the non-existent hospitalization and described episodes of violence with the kind of detail that made them sound like eyewitness accounts of things that had never happened. Linda obtained these emails through the discovery process, and they became part of the evidentiary record. Diane sat across from me in a deposition room in November, and I watched her try to explain those emails. I watched her try to contextualize statements that had no legitimate context. I watched her try to claim that she had been genuinely concerned, and that her concern had expressed itself in ways that were perhaps exaggerated but were not malicious. And I watched Linda systematically take apart every piece of that defense with the precision of someone who had done this many times before and knew exactly where the weak points were. Diane maintained her composure through most of the deposition. She was extraordinarily good at maintaining her composure. She had been maintaining her composure while saying terrible things for 67 years, and she was not going to lose it in a deposition room. But there was a moment, one moment, when something cracked slightly in her surface. It was when Linda played the recording. Not the full 47 minutes, but a specific section, approximately 4 minutes, in which Diane said explicitly that she had been building a record of my behavior and that she had already spoken to an attorney about custody implications. Linda paused the recording and said to Diane, in a tone that was perfectly neutral, "Is this your voice?" And Diane said yes. And Linda said, "And is this an accurate recording of the conversation that took place on the morning of February 14th? And Diane said, "I do not recall saying those specific words." And Linda said, "Are you saying this recording has been edited?" And Diane said, "I am saying I do not believe I said what is represented on this recording." And Linda said, "And yet you identified it as your voice." And Diane said, "Yes." And Linda said, "Then, what is the explanation for how your voice came to be saying things you do not believe you said?" And Diane had no answer for that. There was a particular silence that followed that question. The silence of a woman who had spent her entire life constructing impenetrable defenses, suddenly realizing she was standing in a room where there was no defense available, where the things she had said and the voice she had said it in were right there on a recording that she had confirmed was accurate and was hers. The silence lasted maybe 4 seconds. In the context of a deposition room where every second is recorded, 4 seconds of a woman with no answer is a very long time. James came to the courthouse with me on the day of the hearing. He sat in the gallery behind me, and I could feel him there the way you can feel the presence of someone you have been married to for 16 years, even when you are not looking at them. His mother sat at the defendant's table with Gerald, and she did not look at James, and James did not look at her, and I thought about what that silence cost him. The silence between a son and a mother sitting in a courtroom on opposite sides of a legal proceeding. And I felt grief for that, even though I was the one who had brought the proceeding. Linda played the recording in court. The judge listened. Gerald objected to specific portions on procedural grounds, and was overruled on each one. Diane sat at the defendant's table and listened to her own voice saying the things she had said to me in my kitchen on the morning of February 14th, and her face showed nothing, absolutely nothing. And I thought about what it must feel like to be that controlled, to hear yourself exposed in a court of law, and to maintain the same expression you would have at a dinner party. The judge ruled in my favor on both the defamation claim and the intentional infliction of emotional distress claim. She awarded me damages that were substantial enough to be meaningful, and she was direct in her written opinion about the nature of what Diane had done, describing it as a sustained and deliberate campaign intended to damage the plaintiff's reputation and social standing, and to manipulate family circumstances in a way that would disadvantage the plaintiff in any future legal proceedings. The judge's language was precise and unsparing, and reading it I thought about how different this moment was from the block party in December, where I had stood in Carol's kitchen listening to Diane dismantle my reputation, while I had no recourse and no proof. I had recourse now. I had proof. I had a judge's written opinion confirming, in the formal language of the law, that what I had experienced was real, and that it was wrong, and that it had consequences. After the hearing, James and I sat in his car in the courthouse parking lot for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "I am sorry," and I said, "I know." And he said, "I should have believed you sooner," and I said, "Yes, you should have. But I understand why you did not, because I also spent years not fully trusting my own perception of what she was doing." And he said, "I am going to send her a letter. I am not going to call her. I am going to send her a formal letter telling her that I need a period of no contact, and that if she wants to have a relationship with me and with our children going forward, she is going to need to demonstrate that she understands what she did, and that she is working to understand why she did it." And he said, "I do not know if she is capable of that." And I said, "I do not know either, but that is her problem now, not ours." Diane did not contact us for 4 months after the ruling. Then she sent a letter, not to me but to James, a letter in which she said she was sorry for the pain she had caused, and that she had been speaking to a therapist, and that she was trying to understand her own behavior, and that she hoped that in time there might be a path back to their relationship. James read me the letter, and I said, "That is your decision. She is your mother." And he said, "What do you think?" And I said, "I think an apology that goes to you and not to me is not actually an apology for what she did to me." And he said, "You are right." And he wrote back to her and said the same thing. A month later, she wrote to me. The letter was short and not particularly eloquent, but it was direct in a way that I had never experienced from Diane. Direct without the careful management of language that characterized everything she had said for 16 years. She said she had spent months with a therapist working through why she had done what she had done. She said she understood that she had tried to destroy me because she was afraid that I was taking her son away from her, and that this fear had made her capable of things she was ashamed of. She said she was sorry. She said she could not expect me to forgive her, and that she understood if I never did. I did not respond immediately. I sat with the letter for 2 weeks, and I thought about what it would mean to respond, and what it would mean not to respond, and what person I wanted to be in relation to this particular truth. Then I wrote back. I said I appreciated her honesty. I said I was not ready to forgive her, but that I was willing to keep the door open in the future if she continued the work she said she was doing. I said I needed her to understand that what she had done had caused real damage to real people, to me, to James, to our children who had felt the tension of the preceding months, even if they had not understood its source, and that the path back from that damage was not a short one and could not be rushed. She wrote back and said she understood. Our relationship now is cautious. Diane comes to some family dinners. She sits at the table and she speaks carefully, and she has learned, I think, that the careful management of language that she spent her whole life practicing is no longer an option with me, that I am watching and listening in ways that she knows about because I told her that I have no interest in a performance and only in something real. Whether she is capable of something real, I do not know. I genuinely do not know. What I know is that she is trying in a way that she was not trying before, and that I am watching to see whether the trying continues or whether it fades once the pressure of the legal proceeding and its consequences is sufficiently far in the past. What I want you to know from all of this is something that took me 14 months and a lawsuit and a cold courtroom in Sacramento to understand, which is that your perception of your own experience is valid, even when someone very skilled is telling you that it is not. That the small things, the comments that seem too minor to confront, the distortions that seem too subtle to prove, the campaign that operates below the threshold of what other people can see, those things are real, and they accumulate and they have consequences, and you are not imagining them simply because you cannot point to a single incident and say, there, that is the proof. The proof is sometimes not one thing. The proof is sometimes a pattern, and patterns take time to document, and documentation requires patience and the willingness to record ordinary conversations on an ordinary morning in February and wait 14 months for the moment when those recordings matter. That moment came. I was in a cold Sacramento courtroom, and the judge listened to every word. Leave me a comment, and tell me whether you think I was right to pursue the lawsuit or whether I should have found a different way to handle this. Tell me whether you have a Diane in your life, someone who operates below the surface of what other people can see, someone who has spent years building a case against you in the minds of the people around you. Tell me how you have handled it or how you wish you had handled it, because I think this is something that more women experience than anyone admits, and I think the silence around it is part of what allows it to continue. If you are new here, subscribe and turn on notifications because there are more stories coming, and every single one of them is about a woman who was told she was imagining something that turned out to be completely real. I will see you in the next one.